Father returned to look after the child. He lit the candle and watched as the child bowed down to the shadow on the wall. The man understood what had been happening, how futile his jealousy was. But it was too late. This paper is about the shadows we cast. I want to talk about the shadow as the target text, the boy as the audience, the candle as the means for producing the target text, perhaps a translator. It's a little bit mixed, this metaphor, perhaps a publishing house. And the source text is, well, who exactly? Is it the father, the absent father that the boy bows down to each night? Is it the mother? Is it exactly who? And I'm going to talk about power as well, because it's very easy to say, translation studies, you have a source text, you have someone who translates it, you bring it into the target culture, and there it is, pure and simple. I want to say that Pham's work gives us a very good example of it's not pure and simple at all. It's quite complicated. Pham Duy was born in Hanoi, Vietnam in 1908. He received scholarships to study at French high school in Hanoi, then Louis Le Grand in Paris, and the prestigious École Normale Supérieure. First Vietnamese to graduate with a degree from this top university. Very prestigious. College qualified Frenchmen to teach in French schools, but it did not qualify other people. So Khiem was qualified, but not qualified to teach in France. He went back to Vietnam in 1935. He taught. To everyone's horror, he joined the French army when World War II broke out, trained as an officer. France wasn't interested in fighting, so he eventually went back to Vietnam. And his friends told him, you've only done two things wrong. One is you went to France, the other is you came back. But anyway, he collected stories to make two books, Légendes of Serene Lands and The Woman or the Wife of Nam Shun during the World War, during the Japanese occupation, and these were put into one volume in Paris in 1951 under the original title. A couple of the stories were left out from the first volume and one was omitted from the second. After the Geneva Accords of 1954, Khiem joined the conservative regime in Saigon. He was Secretary of State, and within 5 months he was ambassador to his beloved France. Very French person, his whole personality, and yet very Vietnamese. A man with two cultures. 1957, he published a novel about Nam and Sylvie, which is a love story about a Vietnamese student in love with a French girl. She has an abortion. He can't marry her because he has to go back to Vietnam, look after the family. So it's a tragedy in a way. But the novel was very well written. I translated it, and I wrote to the French publisher about 2 years ago saying, we'd like to publish this. They said, we don't have a copy anymore. We don't have details. This has totally disappeared. His honorary doctorate from the University of Toulouse, Legion of Honor, very distinguished man, and at the end of 57, he was fired from his job. And he stayed in France, not qualified to teach, proud, stubborn man in a way, refused to become French citizen, which his degree would have qualified him then to teach. And he got jobs putting books on shelves, looking after students in dormitories, sort of very low-paying job. He became very depressed, and he eventually committed suicide. So a very, very sad man. So we go back to the 30s, when he first begins to publish stories. It's good. And the 30s, Second World War, he's collecting stories to publish. Collecting some from old texts, this one from 16th century, and collecting stories that he remembers as a child, people told him, and also from textbooks, from all sorts of books that are put out with collections of Vietnamese stories in French in particular. So some for French people, some for French for Vietnamese students learning French, and some just because they were interesting. And he began to collect these, and he began to retell them, some of them in a very literal transcription, just translating them from the Vietnamese or retelling them from the French into his French. If you do it at Melbourne University, they call it plagiarism. Okay. So you need footnotes, you need to say where it came from, you need to use your own language. But in many societies, and I understand in Vietnamese society, for a long time, this is how you became a learned person. It wasn't plagiarism, it was learning. Taking texts that existed, embroidering, developing, expounding. Other people knew the text, other people knew what you were doing. You weren't stealing. You were using, you were displaying your knowledge in your learning. So originality was not important. Repetition, and sometimes embroidery as well. So this is where we begin. The stories, Pham Duy bowing to the stories, taking the place of his absent father, his homeland of Vietnam, and now they become a new work of literature. He was taking from the past, and he was aiming at readers of French, to whom he was indebted for his own high status. New versions were sometimes close to the old, sometimes not. So we can see it in the story of the young wife herself. First part of the story is about the marriage and the child. One paragraph is about the shadow, the absent father. The other third of the story is about the wife who commits suicide. She's taken into the kingdom under the sea. She comes back to see her husband and forgives him, and then disappears with the goddess, the fairy, into the sky. Pham Duy told it in one way that I read to you at the beginning. The original, coming from Vietnamese tradition, tells it in quite another way, and is quite elaborate. It emphasizes certain values that he felt were difficult to explain to his French readers. So he's taking and he's adapting and retelling as well. And to many of the stories, I'm sorry, it's got plastic on the cover. To many of the stories in Legends from Serene Lands, he gives an explanation. Some of these explanations are almost as long as the story. So he's using his power over the story, can you see, to direct the reader's attention, to direct the reader's understanding. Translations are not innocent, and certainly when they're framed, they become totally not innocent. He's directing the reader, who are French, how to understand the story. It's not exoticism, it's self-exoticism. Making yourself known to the French as Vietnamese. And he tells the French, in one of these stories, that just as the French children believe in Sleeping Beauty, so don't call us naive because your children are the same as our Vietnamese children, then the Vietnamese believe in this, the French believe in this. And all these cultural details create a dream that's beyond the modern rational mind. So in a way, the Vietnamese come down again. He uses his power to put them into a childish category. But he says, this is part of our imagination. This is how we conceive the world. In dream, in reality, in myth, in people reaching across from this world to the next, in love that's often fated to somehow create disappointment. But the Vietnamese are wise in their innocence, and these stories show the wisdom, the complexity of Vietnamese for the French. So that being in French, it gives the French power over Vietnamese subjects. But with his comments, it goes the other way. The Vietnamese has power over the French readers as well. He has the power to tell them how to understand the story and how to evaluate the French. Pham Duy published his books in French, so this is 1951. It looks exactly like the other one, except it doesn't have plastic cover on it. And then this book goes in different ways. I'll talk about these separately. A man called George Schultz. Vietnam claims George Schultz. Okay. This is George Schultz's. This book was published in 1965. And it says on the front it's actually Pham Duy Khiem, but it's a mistake. Once you start reading the book, it's Mr. Schultz, Executive Director of the Vietnamese American Association in Saigon between 1956 and 1958. And it's called Vietnamese Legends. And he says in his foreword, among my Vietnamese friends who have aided in the preparation of this collection, I should like to mention the names of Mrs. Nguyen Ngoc Lam, L.T. Bap Lam, Pham Duy Khiem. So he mentions him. So he mentions Pham. It doesn't say he's Vietnamese ambassador to America, to Paris, which he was at this time, but at least he recognizes him. But he's basically taken almost half the stories for his book, Vietnamese Legends, from Pham's book, Legends from Serene Lands. And the critics were very aware of it. Academic reviews of the book, out of 32 stories which compose Vietnamese legends, almost half have been translated from Pham's book. And his critic, he goes on to say, and it's not wrong, superfluous to note that Legends from Serene Lands, far from itself being translated from Vietnamese, stories have all been rewritten, as he admitted. So they have a more literary than folkloric. These stories, Mr. Schultz plagiarized them, Pham plagiarized them. Suddenly, repeating a folk story becomes a whole legal issue, a problem that had not been seen traditionally. And other versions of collection of short stories were also published with many of Pham's stories. These critics, and there are a number of them, are judging by scientific standards. The work belongs to someone. The work is told in a language that is unique to them. someone else who claims it as their own is plagiarizing. So the boy says, that's what my daddy looks like, and I'll only accept one of him. And if you change it, it's wrong. And so this whole idea of capitalism, of intellectual property, begins to come into play. This is George Schultz again, adapted from the Vietnamese. I rather doubt that he had a whole lot of Vietnamese language, but he had some. And this is published by Tay Soi, the Vietnamese government publishing agency. And this is a bilingual edition, and it has no preface. So if Pham is acknowledged in the preface to the previous versions of Vietnamese legends, now he's disappeared. Now it's Mr. Schultz's book. And this is a totally rogue edition. I got my first versions of Pham Duy Khiem's book in Hanoi, photocopied by the side of the road, which is how you get good books. And this strange cover is totally illegal, pirated version. And it has legends from Serene Lands for the first half, from the 1944 one, 1942. And the second half is The Young Wife, but that's photocopied from a different book, and they put it together to make it look like the one original book. So Pham's disappeared. George Schultz has disappeared. Publisher has disappeared. Who does this text belong to? Whose text is it? So the translator has the power to co-opt the writer's work. It's one of the things you should be aware of. You have power. Publisher has the power to change or even obliterate presence of both. And this time, the publisher has been obliterated as well. So in Tay Soi, Vietnamese, this is a collection of stories. English, one side of the page, Vietnamese, the other side of the page. Tags in all Mr. Schultz's stories, not just the Pham Duy Khiem ones, but all Mr. Schultz's stories. 25 of them. Adds a few more. Publishes it with no translator, no editor. It's just there. I have to say that I finally got a translation of Legends from Serene Lands published in India. And I, as a European scholar, reframed the story differently. The preface draws attention to Pham's role as ambassador of South Vietnam to France. It talks about him as the perfect colonial subject. It talks about him borrowing the stories and adapting them for the French audience. So the love stories are like French love stories now. Death is the plane of immortal myrtles. In one of the stories, the first one, Love's Crystal, Pham quotes a little bit from Tale of Q, the most famous Vietnamese story. Everyone knows it, everyone loves it. Really treats you with respect. And he says, well, this is a well-known Vietnamese masterpiece. It's rather as though you're quoting Shakespeare and you say, well, this is a well-known Hamlet English masterpiece. He's very supportive of Vietnamese tradition, but he's very harsh with it as well. He doesn't allow it to speak on its own terms. He shapes the shadows so that the French will recognize them. And there's one more stage in this where my translation was published in Vietnam. A number of things happened. I I'd asked the Vietnamese publisher to publish it before the Des Oies. And they said, we'll publish it, but we want to leave out some stories. Publishers can do that. It's not you translate it and send it and they publish the whole thing. And the first time round, I said, no, I want the whole thing, which is called arrogant. And the second time round, I really wanted it in Hanoi. So I said, yes, which ones would you like to leave out? And they said, these ones, and I said, good, because there weren't very many of them. But the important thing that happened was that the whole framing, the whole introduction, had to be cut down the way it was shaped, framed. You couldn't say in 2015 that Pham was a traitor, that he was the ambassador of South Vietnam. You couldn't say that he really despised, is probably too strong a word, the tale of Khiem. You couldn't say he really wanted the love story to look like a French love story, because it's a Vietnamese story. So it was reduced very much in size. The story's not quite finished yet, because it goes back to France. Again, there's a woman author, Ming Tran Huy, who writes a collection of stories, The Lake Born in One Night. And it's her second book. Her first book, The Princess and the Fisherman, was already the first story in Legends from Serene Lands. And she uses 5 of Pham's stories at different points in the love story of the princess and the fisherman. And then the publisher said, well, we'd like to do a whole collection. We'd like you to do a whole collection of these stories. So she did, 18 of the stories. And 8 of these 18 were stories that Pham told. And she translates them. That's the English translation, not the Seas Wolf Song. She translates them almost word for word from the original. This is Pham. There was once, a long time ago, a Chinese mandarin who had a daughter of great beauty. Like all young girls of her estate, she saw no one and lived a secluded life in a high tower in the mandarin's palace. She usually took her seat near the window to read or embroider, sometimes pausing to look at the river which ran below her, and she dreamed while following it across. It's a very simple style, very pure style. That's it. This is her, if you remember. Once upon a time, a very long time ago, there was once, a long time ago, there lived the daughter of a very senior mandarin. But she takes it and she embroiders it. She's a novelist. And so she can't resist adding to it. So is it plagiarism now? Or is it just taking an idea, taking a story? If I tell my grandchildren Goldilocks and the Three Bears, can I make up a new story or do I have to follow the old story? Is that plagiarism? Endowed with all the graces, she was named, which means beautiful child. Like all young girls of high rank, she lived a reclusive life in women's quarters, located in a high tower of the palace. Like all young girls of her estate, she saw no one and lived a secluded life in the high tower of the mandarin's palace. Constantly surrounded by only her servants, she had no visitors apart from her parents. Her room was sumptuously furnished and the cupboard was crowded with clothes made of the finest, and still extra. But she cared for neither one nor the other. Most of the time she sat by the window, embroidering or reading books of poetry. Sometimes she paused to look at the river, which ran into the distance, and she dreamed of following its silvery waters, far-off places, and of the people that she might meet. We have time. What happens is she sits by the window every day, and she begins to hear a fisherman singing. in the distance. And one day he doesn't come, and she falls sick. And she's sick for a few days. And then he comes back, and she recovers. People begin to understand that there's some connection here, so they ask for the fisherman to be brought to the presence of the girl. He comes, and he is ugly. And she takes one look and says, send him away. That's the end of that illusion. She's a young girl. She recovers. He dies of a broken heart. Very sad story. And he's buried. 3 years later, Pham glosses over this, apparently traditional Vietnamese custom to dig the corpse up, wash the bones, rebury it. So he's dug up, and he's not there. What there is a crystal. This actually comes from a Chinese story, which unfortunately Teri Yamada didn't know. In the Chinese story, it's a blood red ruby crystal. Hard. But the stone is there in the grave. It's made into a cup. Every time tea is poured into the cup, it's a little image of a boat sailing around, a man singing. One day she looks into the cup, sees the boat, cries, and the cup dissolves. And Pham Duy Khiem gives you 3 pages then telling you they've reached out across the void, they were fated to meet in a past life. Now that love has been acknowledged, she's acknowledged that she's done something wrong, she's abused the love that he had for her, he can move on. And so he gives you all that detail. But this is the title of one of her Ming's early stories. And she's got it from Pham Duy Khiem. She doesn't say it comes from him. It's the mother's shadow, not the father's shadow, if you like. She has a little bit in the introduction saying, when I was a child, I read these stories, and I read some of Pham Duy's as well. And they were very beautiful. And they gave me a whole different image of Vietnam from the one my grandparents gave me. A melancholy, sensitive image of Vietnam. Everything passes. Nothing is substantial. It's a Vietnam that existed nowhere but in my spirit. The real country interested me much less than the one that I imagined. So she mentions it in the introduction, just as Mr. Schultz mentioned. But if you don't read introductions, you don't get the point that these are not her stories. Translators can replace authors. Authors can replace authors. Mothers can replace fathers in the casting of the shadows. So there's a lot of power going around. Authors over stories, translators over stories, publishers, readers over what they like, what they will respond to, what they think is important. So we've got all these debates in the universities if you're doing literature. The author is dead. What happened to this author? There is no such thing as a text because no text is original, it's just made out of pre-existing text. We have this idea that plagiarism is stealing. And we shouldn't do it anymore. And interesting, one of Ming's books is about exactly plagiarism. She's an expert on the subject. And this is a story, Double Life of Anna, about a woman. It's a real story, Joyce Hatto, you can look it up, Google it. And she was a pianist, and she didn't put out, her husband made over 100 records of classical music in her name. She was the most famous unknown pianist in England, until one day someone put the CD into their track and it came up with someone else's name on it. And then it was traced down, and people were saying, no, this is bad. And the husband says, this is part of our debate to finish it, readjusting reality is not a crime. Otherwise we'd all be criminals. We spend half our life readjusting reality. We're all spiritual vagabonds, having our night populated with dreams in which our imagination expands, leaving fantasies to infiltrate our thought. Who can distinguish between what is true, just, precise, and what is not? It happens that truth is woven through with impostures, that the hollows are as important as the plains, that dead objects count as much as, and sometimes more than, the things we take for granted. We are all fictional beings. Think of that for a minute. When you wake up in the morning, who are you? Are you Billy Joe, who goes to Melbourne University, who does this and this? You're just a body. You could be anyone. And then you put on that identity, and off you go on the train to Melbourne University. We're all fictional beings, and our dreams define us better than our names, our nationality, the date and place of birth. I've created the myth of unscience to give shape to my imagination and nourish those of many others as well. Plagiarism's justified. This is what he's arguing. Because it nourishes people's dreams. It gives them literature. It helps them to fantasize and accept. Isn't that what we ask of an artist who has partly opened the doors of a world in which banality flourishes? Open the doors out, so that ugliness can supplement itself as beauty. Disillusionment of our existence, slumber in the sun of art, and fall silent in the light that mixes of a life circumstance. Reality is not false when it is presented as a lie. I say this in my book. It's not false. It fulfills in strange and marvelous spaces those of freedom. It is in this sense that Anna's song has always been true. Believe it or not. So if we want some translation studies conclusion, I've tacked a few on here. Previous things said there's nothing wrong with plagiarism. The translators are the best of all. But there's more involved in translation than taking a text and moving it to the target culture. And there's all those processes, editing, of shaping, of bringing in culture, bringing in ideology, worldview, if you like, the way we see the world. André Lefebvre said that there are 4 dimensions in every translation: language, culture, ideology, worldview, the way we see the world, and poetics. The way we tell stories in English is not the same as the way we tell stories in Vietnamese. And translation, publishing of translation, is not an innocent process. There's power. What is chosen? Which stories Pham chooses? Which stories Mr. Schultz chooses? How the target text is achieved, what goes into it, what gets left out, and how it's accepted in the target culture. You notice that French people are going to buy a collection of short stories it sells, and they're interested in an exotic view of Vietnam. Almost all of her novels are exactly the same. Vietnamese girl living in France, because Ming lives in Paris, she was born in Paris, meets another Vietnamese boy. They go back to Vietnam. It's not as good as Paris, which all the French readers are reading it and saying, yeah, of course, we knew that. And so the poetics of telling a story brings power over how the story is shaped, and the target culture has power over the translation. I want to emphasize that power factor. And also point out that plagiarism is historical. In some cultures, it's legitimate to what we would call plagiarism. to take from the great, to take from traditional writings. Make it your own, and sometimes it's not, but it's an exercise in power. I think that's as much as I want to say. We can have questions.